"Ma'am, that seat is reserved for our priority members. You need to move." Now, Deborah Whitfield did not whisper it. She said it loud enough for row 1 to hear, loud enough for the gate agents still scanning boarding passes outside to hear, loud enough that a mother 3 rows back pulled her toddler's headphones off just to listen. Camille Bennett did not look up right away. She finished the sentence she was writing in the margin of her sketchbook, closed the cover over her pen, and only then raised her eyes to the woman standing over her with a tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. That was 7:41 in the morning, Charlotte Douglas International Airport, Gate C-19. Meridian Airways Flight 512 to Denver was scheduled to leave the ground in 19 minutes. Nobody in that cabin yet understood that before the wheels ever left the tarmac, a woman's career would already be finished. A $72 million contract would be frozen by a phone call, and an airline that prided itself on quiet, expensive hospitality would spend the next 5 months rebuilding itself from the inside out. But that comes later. First, you need to understand who was sitting in seat 2A and why she had every right to be there. Camille Bennett was 20 years old, a third-year architecture student at a design college outside Charlotte, and she had spent the last 6 weeks redrawing the same corridor 41 times. Not because it was wrong, because it wasn't yet honest. Her final concept for the National Urban Futures Summit was a public transit terminal built around a single idea her mother used to say out loud while doing the dishes: a building should never make a person prove they belong in it. Camille had written that sentence on the inside cover of a leather journal 3 years ago, the week after her mother, Renee Bennett, died of a stroke in the parking lot of a hardware store. She still carried that journal everywhere. It had a water stain on the back cover from a spilled coffee in 9th grade and a cracked spine held together with book tape, and if you flipped to the very last page, you would find, in her mother's slanted handwriting, half a grocery list and 1 unfinished sentence. A room tells you if you're welcome before anyone says a word. And Camille never finished reading that sentence out loud to anyone. She didn't need to. She had spent 3 years finishing it with her own life. Beside her in seat 2B sat her older sister, Jordan Bennett, 21, a systems and data analyst who had taken a semester off from her master's program to help build the back end for their father's company. Jordan didn't draw buildings. She built the invisible architecture underneath them. The databases, the flags, the logs that decided who got remembered as a threat and who got remembered as a guest. She was traveling to Denver to present alongside her sister because their joint thesis argued something simple and, as it turned out, dangerously relevant. That bias doesn't only live in walls and doorways. It lives in what gets typed into a system after the door has already closed. Their father, Marcus Bennett, had booked their tickets 6 weeks earlier. Tuesday, June 16th, at 9:14 in the evening, from his home office in Charlotte, using the same corporate account his company used for every business trip. Seats 2A and 2B, first class, Meridian Airways Flight 5112, confirmation number MR4471X. He had done it without ceremony, the way he did most things. He didn't tell his daughters that his company, Solstice Dynamics, happened to be 6 weeks into final negotiations for a $72 million contract with the very airline they were about to fly. Why would he? To him, it was simply the fastest non-stop route to Denver. Marcus Bennett wore a gray hoodie to work most days. He drove a 7-year-old pickup truck. He was, by every visible measure at Gate C-19 that morning, nobody in particular. And neither, Deborah Whitfield had already decided, were his daughters. She had noticed them the moment they boarded. 21 minutes before the first sentence was spoken, while she was still walking the aisle in first class, with the kind of warmth that made regular customers feel like family. She greeted the retired couple in row, one by name. Remembered that Mr. Alvarez preferred his coffee black, and refilled a young man's water glass in seat 2C before he'd asked. When she reached row 2 and saw two young black women, one in a faded university hoodie, sketchbook open on her tray table, the other scrolling through a spreadsheet on her phone, her smile thinned by exactly 1 degree. She kept walking. She came back 90 seconds later with her tablet already raised. "Boarding passes," she said. "Not a question. An instruction." Camille handed hers over without comment. Jordan did the same. Deborah studied both passes for a long moment, turned them over as if something might be printed on the back, then studied the sisters' faces, the way you'd study a photograph you suspected had been altered. "Who purchased these seats?" she asked. "Our father," Jordan said. "6 weeks ago. And is he traveling with you today?" "No," Camille said. "We're both adults." A beat of silence followed, the kind that has weight, the kind a stranger 3 rows back can feel land on her own chest, even though it isn't hers to carry. Deborah lowered her voice only slightly, which somehow made it worse, because now it sounded like a secret everyone was still allowed to hear. "I just want to be sure there wasn't some kind of confusion at the gate," she said. "These seat numbers can be easy to misread." Jordan's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. "The passes say 2A and 2B. That's where we're seated. Notice something here, because it matters later." Across the aisle, in seat 2C, sat a young white man in a gray sweatshirt, nearly identical to the one Marcus Bennett wore most mornings. Deborah had not asked him a single question. She had not asked who purchased his ticket. She had adjusted his air vent without being asked. The sisters noticed. Neither said it out loud. Not yet. Deborah asked for identification next. Camille reached into her bag with hands that stayed perfectly steady, though something had begun tightening behind her ribs, a pressure she recognized the way you recognize weather before it arrives. She had felt this exact pressure at a hotel front desk in Raleigh 2 years ago, and once at a jewelry counter in a shopping mall. And she had learned, the hard way, that panic only ever made things worse for people who looked like her. So she stayed still. She stayed quiet. She stayed, in fact, more polite than the situation required. And if you have ever had to perform calm on command just to keep yourself safe, you already know exactly what that costs. Renata Cole, the second flight attendant working first class that morning, stood near the galley, watching the exchange with a knot forming low in her stomach. She had worked with Deborah for 4 years. She had never seen her check an ID this carefully, not once, not even during random security spot checks. Renata didn't say anything yet either. Keep her in mind. She becomes important soon, and not in the way you'd expect. The identification check was nearly finished, Deborah's thumb hovering over her tablet screen, when a man in a charcoal travel blazer stepped into first class and stopped cold at row 2. His name was Grant Osborne. He flew this Charlotte to Denver route roughly twice a month for a regional logistics firm, held Meridian's highest loyalty tier, and had, for the last 11 months, sat in seat 2A by habit rather than assignment. He looked at Camille. He did not look at his own boarding pass. "That's my seat," he said. "I always sit there." "Move her," he told Deborah, and pointed toward the aisle, as if Camille were furniture that needed rearranging. Here is where the story could have ended in less than 90 seconds. Renata stepped forward before Deborah could answer, pulled up the digital seating chart, and read it out loud in a voice that left no room for interpretation. Camille Bennett, seat 2A. Jordan Bennett, seat 2B. Grant Osborne, seat 2C. There was no duplicate assignment, no equipment change, no note of any kind. Grant Osborne's seat was across the aisle, and it always had been. Grant's face reddened, not with embarrassment at being wrong, but with the particular irritation of a man discovering that the facts had failed to agree with him. "I fly this route every other week," he said. "Meridian knows how to take care of people who actually matter to this airline." And that was the sentence that decided everything. Deborah's posture softened toward him instantly, the way a compass needle settles toward north. "I'm sorry, Mr. Osborne," she said. "Let me see what I can arrange." The apology went to him, not to Camille, whose identity had just been scrutinized like a forged document. Not to Jordan, whose license was still sitting untouched on the tray table. "Miss Bennett," Deborah said, turning back to Camille with the practiced patience of someone who had already decided who would be asked to sacrifice, "we can move you to 2C and find your sister a seat back in premium economy. I'll credit both accounts with courtesy miles." Camille looked at the empty seat across the aisle, the one that had belonged to Grant Osborne all along, and then back at Deborah. "Why would we be split up when the man in the wrong seat is standing right here?" "First class prioritizes travelers with established preferences," Deborah said, when possible. Jordan closed her sister's sketchbook gently, the way you'd close a door you didn't want slammed. "We have a schedule too," she said. "A ticket doesn't stop being valid because the person holding it is wearing a hoodie instead of a blazer." A few heads turned in the cabin. Grant shifted his weight, less embarrassed by what had just been named than embarrassed at having it named out loud, in front of witnesses, at 7:44 in the morning. "You're misunderstanding a routine service adjustment," Deborah said, her voice dropping. Jordan held her gaze. Her anger showed nowhere except in the perfect stillness of her face. No clenched fist, no raised voice. Nothing you could point to and call proof. "You checked our IDs twice before you checked his boarding pass once," she said. "That isn't routine. That's a pattern, and we both know it." Something shifted in Deborah's expression. Not doubt, but offense. "That is a serious accusation to make while the crew is trying to help you," she said. "I'd be careful." It was phrased as advice. It landed like a warning. Now hold that image for a second, a woman in a crisp navy uniform telling two paying passengers to be careful. In a cabin full of witnesses, 19 minutes before departure, because it is going to come back to her with interest before this story is finished. Deborah opened the incident log on her tablet. Her thumbs moved fast. Camille caught 4 words on the screen before Deborah angled it away. Passengers declined voluntary accommodation. "We never volunteered anything," Camille said. "You're writing down something that didn't happen." "Internal reports aren't passenger documents," Deborah said, covering the screen with her palm. "They become our documents the moment you use them to describe us," Camille answered. Renata saw the same line Camille had seen, and it sat wrong in her stomach for the rest of that morning. The report made Deborah's request sound generous, and the sisters' refusal sound unreasonable. It said nothing about Grant Osborne's demand, nothing about the confirmed seat assignments, nothing about the fact that a man in the correct row had simply been asked, once, politely, and had refused. Deborah pressed save. The tone was small. Renata felt it like a lock turning somewhere she couldn't see. "Please write it clearly, then," Camille said, her voice even. "You're asking us to give up seats we paid for so the man assigned to 2C can have a window. Is that accurate?" Deborah did not answer. The cabin had gone quiet enough that the hiss of the ventilation system sounded almost loud. Grant looked away, suddenly very interested in his phone. And Deborah, who had built an 18-year career on the idea that she could read a cabin better than anyone else on this aircraft, reached for the interphone and pressed the call button for the ground manager. That call would have been the reasonable end of this. It was not. By the time Denise Okafor, the ground operations manager, was paged from gate C-19, Deborah had already changed the story in her head, and within 4 minutes, she changed it out loud, too. What had started as a seating dispute became, in her retelling, a question of conduct. She stood beside row 2 with her tablet pressed to her ribs and told the second attendant arriving at the door that the 2 passengers in row 2 were uncooperative, confrontational, and responsible for delaying the flight. Every one of those words was false. The sisters were seated. Their bags were stowed. The aisle was clear. No safety announcement had been made, no instruction disobeyed. Neither of them had raised her voice above a normal speaking tone even once. But the words arrived first, and words that arrive first tend to become the shape everything after them is forced to fit. "We are not refusing a safety instruction," Jordan said. "We're refusing a request that doesn't match our tickets." "Passengers don't get to decide which crew instructions count," Deborah answered. And the sentence was built to end the conversation, not settle it. Renata pulled up the incident log again and read the newest entry twice. Confrontational behavior, uncooperative passengers, refusing crew direction. She had watched the entire exchange from 8 feet away. None of it was true. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. "They haven't done anything, Deborah. We just need Mr. Osborne to sit in his assigned seat." Deborah steered her by the elbow into the galley, out of earshot of the cabin. "Do not undermine me in front of passengers," she said, quiet and sharp. "You're not seeing the whole situation." Renata looked back over her shoulder. She was seeing the whole situation. 2 women sitting calmly with valid boarding passes. A man standing in the aisle refusing to take the seat that was legally his. And a lead flight attendant who had now told 2 different lies to 2 different people in under 6 minutes. Renata said nothing more out loud, but she opened the audit function on her own tablet quietly and saved a time-stamped screen capture of the false entry before it could be edited again. Her thumb trembled once before she pressed confirm. She didn't know yet that this single, quiet, unglamorous act of copying a file would end up mattering more than anything anyone said that morning. 3 rows back, in seat 5C, a woman in reading glasses had already opened the camera app on her phone. Her name was Dr. Miriam Ashworth, a professor of sociology at the University of Denver. Flying home from a conference on institutional bias in public services, a subject she had spent 19 years studying from behind a lectern, and was now, without asking for it, watching unfold 6 feet in front of her in real time. She began recording the moment she heard Deborah tell the cabin, loudly enough for rows 1 through 6 to hear, that passengers who belonged in the cabin were being made to wait because of the 2 women in row 2. Her camera caught Camille's boarding pass, clearly marked 2A. It caught Grant Osborne's, clearly marked 2C. It caught the sisters sitting completely still while a man in a blazer blocked the aisle. And it caught Deborah questioning them 4 separate times without once asking Grant why he had refused his own assigned seat. Grant noticed the phones lifting around the cabin and turned, sensing the room's attention was drifting away from the sisters and toward him. "We're going to miss our departure window because they want to turn this into a whole thing," he announced to no one and everyone. A few passengers checked their watches. Someone near the back exhaled hard, annoyed. Grant relaxed slightly as the irritation in the cabin redirected itself toward the sisters, exactly the way he'd hoped it would. Then Jordan spoke, quiet enough that people had to lean in, which somehow made it land harder than shouting ever could have. "We didn't create a fight," she said. "We're refusing to disappear so you can be comfortable." The cabin went completely still. A woman by the window in row 3 nodded once almost involuntarily. A man behind Grant muttered, low but audible, "She has the seat, man." It wasn't loud support. It wasn't even brave support. But it was support, and Deborah heard it, and for the first time that morning, something shifted behind her eyes. Not doubt exactly, but the sudden, disorienting sensation of a room she had always assumed she controlled beginning to slip sideways out of her hands. She looked at the phones. She looked at Renata's carefully neutral face. She looked at the passengers who were now watching her. Instead of the 2 sisters, she'd spent 7 minutes trying to make into the problem. And then Deborah Whitfield made the choice that would end her career. She lifted the interphone and called airport security. Her voice went flat, clipped, official. The voice of someone reciting a script rather than describing an event. "I have 2 passengers refusing crew direction in first class," she said. "They're confrontational, and they're delaying this flight." She ended the call before anyone could correct a single word of it. 6 minutes later, at 7:53 in the morning, 2 uniformed officers stepped through the aircraft door with their hands resting near their radios. Before either of them had exchanged a single word with Camille or Jordan, they had already been told, by the only person who'd spoken to them, exactly who the problem was. Officer Derek Voss moved like a man who believed speed mattered more than accuracy. He listened to Deborah's version first, the only version anyone had offered him, and nodded before she'd even finished the sentence. He did not ask Camille what happened. He did not ask Jordan. He did not ask Grant Osborne, still standing in the aisle in the wrong row, a single question. Officer Nadia Reyes, walking a half step behind him, checked the boarding passes herself before saying anything at all. Her eyes moved from Camille's pass to Jordan's, then across the aisle to Grant's. "They're assigned to these seats," she said quietly. 2A and 2B. His is 2C. "The seat isn't the issue anymore," Voss said, without looking at the passes Nadia was holding out to him. "They're refusing a crew instruction. That's what matters here. Notice what just happened, because it happens more often than any of us would like to admit. A valid boarding pass, a documented fact, a piece of paper that settled the entire question in 11 seconds. And it was waved away because acknowledging it would have meant admitting Deborah Whitfield was wrong. A valid ticket had just become irrelevant because by then, her decision needed protecting more than the truth did. Camille took out her phone and began recording her own statement, her hand perfectly steady even as her pulse hammered somewhere. She wasn't going to let anyone see. "For the record," she said, "this is Camille Bennett. My sister is Jordan Bennett. We're on Meridian Flight 512, Gate C19, and the time is 7:54 in the morning. Our assigned seats are 2A and 2B. Mr. Osborne is assigned to 2C. Ms. Whitfield asked us to move so he could have the window. We have not raised our voices, threatened anyone, or touched anyone." "Put the phone away," Voss said. "Am I a safety threat for recording my own statement?" Camille asked. "You need to follow instructions." That wasn't my question. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Jordan watched the cabin around them. Some passengers staring openly now, others looking down at their laps, uncomfortable but silent. And she understood exactly what was happening, because she had studied exactly this pattern for the last 18 months of her thesis work. Every calm sentence from her sister was being treated as resistance, specifically because it refused to make Deborah's version of events any easier to believe. If they stayed seated, someone would call it defiance. If they stood too fast, someone would call it aggression. There was no safe way to move. There was only a safer record. "We'll step off the aircraft to keep this from escalating further," Camille said. "But I want it documented that we are not leaving voluntarily. Don't cancel our tickets. Don't touch our checked bags. Don't alter this report. Record the name of every person involved in this decision." Deborah gave no confirmation. Voss told them to gather their things. Jordan stood first. As she lifted her tote bag off the floor, the strap caught the edge of the tray table, and Camille's leather journal slid out and landed open in the center of the aisle. Pages fanned across the carpet. On the inside cover, in her mother's slanted handwriting, half a grocery list and one unfinished sentence sat exposed for anyone close enough to read it. "A room tells you if you're welcome before anyone says a word, and that's—" Officer Voss put his hand around Jordan's upper arm to steer her toward the front of the cabin. It wasn't a grip meant to hurt. It didn't need to be. It was firm enough that every watching passenger read danger into her body anyway. Firm enough that the woman in row 3, the one who had nodded a minute earlier, pressed a hand flat against her own mouth. Jordan didn't pull away. Her face stayed composed. Underneath it, humiliation, moved through her like heat through a closed room, with nowhere to go and no window to open. Camille knelt in the aisle and gathered the scattered pages of her mother's journal one at a time, her fingers moving with a care that had nothing to do with the officers watching her, and everything to do with the woman who had written those words 3 years and 11 months ago. "You need to move now," Deborah said. Dr. Ashworth stood, phone still recording. "They have caused no disturbance," she said, loud enough for the whole cabin. "I have recorded this entire exchange from the beginning." "Ma'am, sit down," Deborah told her. "You're interfering with a security matter." "No," Dr. Ashworth said. "I'm witnessing one. As Camille and Jordan were walked off the aircraft at 7:58 that morning, Grant Osborne stepped around them without a word and lowered himself into seat 2A. The seat that had never once been his, and adjusted the air vent above his head, like a man settling into something he'd earned. Hold on to that image. It matters again in about 90 seconds. At gate C-19, the pace of everything changed. Denise Okafor, the ground operations manager, had already been reviewing the flight manifest on her own terminal when the sisters were escorted through the jet bridge, and something on her screen stopped her cold. A flag she hadn't noticed until this exact moment, attached to the reservation under Marcus Bennett's corporate travel account. She read it twice to be sure. Then she picked up her own radio, and her voice, when it came through, had none of the practiced calm Deborah's had carried onto that aircraft 20 minutes earlier. "This is Denise at C-19, she said. "I need someone from corporate accounts on this channel right now. The reservation attached to the passengers you just removed belongs to Solstice Dynamics. That's the Bennett account, the $72 million account. I need eyes on this before anyone signs anything today." That was the first layer. A flag on a screen, buried in corporate metadata, meaning absolutely nothing about who deserved dignity and everything about how quickly an airline could suddenly discover a reason to care. The second layer arrived 9 minutes later, when Marcus Bennett walked through security at Charlotte Douglas. He had been 30 minutes behind his daughters on a separate connecting flight from a client meeting in Raleigh, planning to meet them at the gate in Denver, and instead found both of them sitting on a metal bench outside gate C-19, Jordan's forearm still faintly marked where Voss's hand had gripped it. Camille's journal held closed against her chest, like something that had nearly been lost. He didn't ask what happened yet. He crossed the terminal, pulled both of his daughters into his arms, and held them until he felt Jordan's shoulders finally drop from where they'd been locked near her ears since 7:53 that morning. Then he asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. "Do you want to go home, keep going to Denver, or wait here until we get an answer?" Camille looked down at the journal in her hands. "They only started listening once they figured out who you were," she said. Marcus looked past her, toward the gate, toward the aircraft, still sitting at the jet bridge with its door open. "Then we fix it," he said. "So next time nobody has to figure out who anybody's father is before a ticket gets believed." That afternoon at 1:20, Solstice Dynamics formally paused the final signing of its $72 million partnership agreement with Meridian Airways, a fare incident reporting platform. The company had spent 14 months building specifically to help large service industries catch exactly the kind of pattern that had just played out in row 2 of Flight 512. Marcus made the reason public himself in a 2-paragraph statement his communications team hadn't drafted and, honestly, wished he'd let them soften. "This isn't punishment," he wrote. "It's simply that we cannot, in good conscience, build a fairness platform for a company that has just demonstrated it doesn't yet understand what fairness requires." Meridian's executives had walked into that Monday expecting, at worst, an angry customer complaint email. Instead, they were looking at a stalled 9-figure contract, a viral video with 1 million views by dinner time, and a preservation order demanding every log, every timestamp, and every version of Deborah Whitfield's incident report be frozen exactly as it stood. The next morning, an outside review team with no prior relationship to Meridian Airways began a 60-day audit. They didn't start with anyone's intentions. They started with timestamps, the same way Renata Cole had, quietly, alone, in a galley at 7:47 that morning. What they found stopped being about one flight attendant by day 11. Over the previous 31 months, the same handful of words, uncooperative, confrontational, not a fit, had appeared in 14 separate incident reports involving Meridian's first-class cabins, almost always attached to passengers of color, almost never attached to a single specific observable action. 9 passengers had been asked to show boarding passes a second time after other travelers in the same row were waved through without a glance. 5 had been pressured to give up a confirmed seat for someone with higher loyalty status. In 8 of the 14 files, the word confrontational appeared with no description of any actual confrontation at all. Just the word itself, dropped into a report like a verdict with no trial attached. It was not one employee's bad morning. It was a pattern the system had been quietly rewarding for years because it moved fast and it protected the people already in charge. Deborah Whitfield sat for her formal interview on day 42 of the review, wearing a plain gray blazer instead of her uniform. Without the wings pinned to her lapel and the tablet in her hands, she looked, investigators later said, smaller than anyone expected. Not because she had changed, but because the uniform had been doing more work than any of them had realized. She said she had been protecting the departure schedule. She said she had been trying to take care of a loyal customer. She mentioned the sisters' age, their clothing, the absence of an older traveling companion, as though any of it had ever been relevant to 2 boarding passes with 2 matching seat numbers. Before you decided those 2 women were the problem, the lead investigator asked her, sliding both boarding passes across the table, what exactly did you verify? Deborah looked toward her attorney. I didn't know who their father was, she said. You didn't need to know who their father was, the investigator answered, reading one line from Camille's written statement aloud. You only needed to read 2 tickets. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. It wasn't the silence of someone finally understanding. It was the silence of someone hearing her entire defense reduced to a single sentence she had no way left to argue with. When the findings reached Marcus Bennett's desk, he didn't ask for mass firings, and he didn't ask for an apology tour. He gave Meridian's board a list of conditions for reopening contract talks, and the list was longer and more specific than anyone in that boardroom had expected from a man who still drove a 7-year-old pickup truck to client meetings. Publish the independent findings in full. Ban seat changes tied to loyalty status once a seat is confirmed. Require every behavioral label in an incident report to be tied to one specific observable action. No more words like confrontational floating free with nothing underneath them. Build an independent reporting channel that frontline employees could use without their supervisor's permission. Protect any employee who challenged a decision or preserved evidence by name, in writing. Reopen all 14 flagged cases. Fund an $11 million passenger dignity and training initiative, and tie every phase of the Solstice Dynamics contract to measurable proof that the reforms were actually working, not just announced. Meridian's board accepted every condition inside of 9 days. Deborah Whitfield's employment ended on the 22nd of July. Not because of one bad decision, but because the investigation found she had entered false information into an official record, treated 2 passengers by a different standard than everyone else in that cabin, and pressured a colleague to stay silent about it. Derek Voss was pulled from all passenger-facing duty, pending retraining and recertification. Nadia Reyes, who had checked the boarding passes and told the truth out loud but hadn't pushed harder when it mattered, received a formal written warning for recognizing the error and not escalating it. Renata Cole was granted whistleblower protection and a permanent seat on Meridian's new incident review board. Grant Osborne lost his loyalty status entirely and was barred from booking any Meridian flight for 18 months. Meridian also opened a separate internal review into why Deborah's original false report had remained active in the system for 6 full hours after Denise Okafor had already confirmed the seat assignments were correct, a gap nobody in leadership could adequately explain, and one that told the review team almost as much about the airline as Deborah's own actions had. None of it, though, changed what Camille and Jordan carried home with them. The corrected report reached Camille's inbox on a Tuesday morning, nearly 3 months after Flight 512 at 9:03 a.m. She read every line twice, confirmed that the word uncooperative had finally been deleted, then opened her boarding pass photo from that morning and checked the seat numbers again. 2A, 2B. She already knew them by heart. Still, her eyes went back to the numbers, as if certainty could slip away the instant she stopped looking directly at it. In the weeks after that flight, Camille began photographing every seat assignment before she sat down anywhere: trains, movie theaters, restaurants that used reservation apps. She memorized the names on every badge at every counter she approached. She located the nearest exit out of habit now, in rooms where nothing had ever gone wrong. From the outside, these habits looked practical, almost admirable, the kind of thing a careful traveler does. Her father recognized the fear underneath them immediately because he had spent 49 years quietly building habits of his own for exactly the same reason. Jordan carried hers differently. She stopped raising her voice even when she had every right to, softened every request into something smaller and safer before it left her mouth, and found herself apologizing for taking up space in rooms she had every legal right to occupy. It took her 4 months and one long conversation with her father, sitting on the back porch with 2 untouched cups of coffee going cold between them, to notice she was doing it at all. Marcus didn't give either of his daughters a speech about strength. He arranged counseling for both of them, declined nearly every interview request that came his way, and told one persistent reporter, on the record, that his daughters were not public property just because something public had happened to them. On the very afternoon of the canceled flight, the 3 of them had rebooked on a different airline entirely and flown to Denver together, arriving too late for the main judging round of the National Urban Futures Summit. There was no last-minute trophy waiting to repair what the morning had cost them. The organizers offered a slot in a smaller evening session instead, and Jordan nearly turned it down. Camille talked her into it, because by then the project no longer belonged only to a canceled morning flight. It belonged to everything that had happened after it, too. Standing in front of that smaller room that evening, Camille presented the newer, more guarded version of her terminal design first, the one she'd sketched in the weeks right after the flight. Narrower corridors, more cameras, more checkpoints, a building shaped entirely around suspicion. A space becomes unfair, she told the room, the moment someone has to prove their worth before their documents are even believed. Jordan followed with a timeline built from her sister's phone recording, the boarding passes, and Dr. Ashworth's video, laid out with the same clean precision she brought to every database she'd ever built. Bias becomes dangerous, she said, the instant a feeling gets typed into a system and stored as if it were a fact. Nobody in that room mentioned their father's name once. Nobody needed to. Months later, working alongside Renata Cole and a small team of instructors from Meridian's new training division, the sisters helped build a practical framework the airline eventually rolled out to every frontline employee. 4 words, easy enough to remember under pressure, when pressure is exactly when people forget everything they were ever taught. Pause, meaning stop before letting instinct calcify into conclusion. Verify, meaning check tickets and records and observable facts before anything else, including status. Describe, meaning write down what a person actually did, never what you assumed about them. Protect, meaning build a real safe path for any employee who challenges a bad decision or preserves evidence that someone more senior would rather see disappear. During one late planning session, Camille admitted something she hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even her father. She said she had spent months after the flight trying to stay perfectly, unnaturally calm in every public interaction, because some part of her believed that any visible emotion, fear, anger, even tears, would be used as proof that she'd been the problem all along. Renata, sitting across the table, was quiet for a moment before she answered. "You should never have to perform innocence just to be treated fairly," she said. That sentence stayed with Camille longer than almost anything else from that entire year. She began to understand, slowly, that her dignity had never actually depended on being the perfect, unshakable victim. A frightened person still deserved basic respect. So did someone who cried, or shook, or raised her voice after being humiliated in front of 40 strangers at 7:44 in the morning. Camille went back to her original terminal drawings, the open ones, the ones from before the flight, and began removing the walls she'd added in fear. She widened corridors back out. She replaced watchful cameras with clear signage and visible help desks positioned exactly where a stranger would first look for one. She had learned, in the hardest possible way, that belonging is shaped by far more than concrete and glass. A glance, a question asked twice, a report typed in 6 minutes, a supervisor's silence in a galley. Any one of them could define a space as completely as its architecture ever could. One evening, reviewing her daughter's revised plans at the kitchen table, Marcus said something Camille wrote down on the same page as her mother's unfinished sentence, right beneath it, so the 2 lines would always sit together. "Respect doesn't begin the moment we discover someone is important," he told her. "It has to begin before we know anything about them at all." 5 months after Flight 512, Camille and Jordan opened the Meridian Airways booking page together, in the same kitchen, at the same table. They chose the same Charlotte to Denver route, the same airline, the same 2 seats, 2A and 2B. By the time that day arrived, Meridian no longer accepted a polished incident report simply because a senior employee had written it with confidence. The new system flagged words like aggressive, uncooperative, and not a fit automatically, and returned them to the employee with a single required field. Describe the specific action. Seat changes now required a documented operational reason, full stop. Loyalty status could no longer override a confirmed assignment, no matter who was asking or how many times they'd flown that route. Frontline staff could request an independent review without their supervisor's permission. And once any case was flagged as a possible discrimination complaint, every video file, every timestamp, every written record was locked from further editing the moment the flag was raised. Marcus Bennett had told Meridian's board, in the same quiet voice he used for everything, that trust wasn't a package a company received the week after it published an apology. It had to be earned in 100 small, ordinary decisions. Especially the ones made when no camera, no executive, and no $72 million contract was watching. Camille and Jordan boarded that new flight alone. No manager waited at the gate. No note had been quietly attached to their names in the system. Not one member of that crew had been told whose daughters they were, and that anonymity mattered to both sisters more than almost anything else that day. They didn't want flawless treatment born out of an airline's fear of another headline. They wanted something much smaller and much harder to guarantee. Ordinary fairness, offered to 2 strangers nobody in that cabin had any reason to recognize. Camille reached row 2 and paused for half a second beside seat 2A. The old morning came back to her all at once. Deborah's narrowed eyes, the weight of Derek Voss's hand near his radio, the sound of her mother's journal hitting the carpet. Then she set her bag in the overhead bin and sat down by the window. Jordan settled into 2B beside her and opened the same journal that had fallen in that exact aisle 5 months earlier. Its corners were worn soft now. Several pages had been carefully replaced, but she had kept the original water-stained cover exactly as it was because she had come to believe that damaged things didn't always need to be hidden to still be worth carrying. Camille slipped both boarding passes into the seatback pocket in front of her. She didn't photograph the seat numbers this time. It was a small gesture, small enough that no one else on that aircraft would ever notice it. Jordan noticed. She reached over and touched her sister's wrist once, briefly, then went back to her own reading. Boarding continued around them. 2 rows back, a white passenger stopped beside the aisle in row 4 and stared down at a young black man already seated by the window, headphones on, a paperback open in his lap. "He must be in the wrong seat," the passenger said to the nearest flight attendant, his own boarding pass still folded, unchecked, in his own hand. Camille felt her shoulders tighten instantly. Jordan's eyes lifted from her journal. The new attendant, a woman named Priya Adebayo, who had transferred into first class only 3 weeks earlier as part of Meridian's rebuilt training program, didn't glance at the seated man's clothing and didn't ask who had purchased his ticket. She asked for both boarding passes and checked the seat numbers on her handheld device without a flicker of hesitation. "Seat 4A belongs to this passenger," she said, handing the standing man his own pass back. "Your confirmed seat is 4C. "I always take the window," he said. "I understand," Priya answered. "Today your seat is 4C. He looked around the cabin, clearly expecting someone, anyone, to step in and negotiate the outcome in his favor. Nobody did. He crossed the aisle and sat down without another word. Priya asked the young man in 4A whether he needed help storing his bag, then simply continued down the aisle, boarding the rest of the flight exactly as she would have boarded any other. There was no incident report, no security officer walking through that door with a conclusion already formed, no public humiliation, no viral video, no frozen contract. The flight didn't lose a single minute of its departure window. The entire exchange, start to finish, ended with less friction than deciding where to store a carry-on bag. Jordan looked over at Camille. Neither of them smiled. Exactly. This wasn't the kind of moment that called for triumph. Nobody else on that aircraft had any idea what had happened on Flight 512 5 months earlier. And that, more than anything, was the entire point. The young man in 4A hadn't needed to call a father, a lawyer, a journalist, or anyone with influence of any kind. His boarding pass had simply been enough on its own. Before a single person in that cabin knew a single thing about who he was. Jordan turned to the first page of her journal, where she had crossed out an old line and written a new one just beneath it, the ink still slightly darker than everything around it. "Dignity isn't a premium service," it read. "It's the minimum standard." The aircraft door closed on schedule. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Camille watched the Charlotte skyline slide past the window and shrink into the distance. She still carried the memory of that morning. She probably always would. But for the first time since it happened, it didn't control the shape of every single movement she made. Jordan looked down at the corrected timeline, still open on her tablet, then closed it and looked out at the runway instead. Nobody asked Camille and Jordan Bennett, who had paid for their seats that day. Nobody questioned why they were sitting where they were sitting. They had never actually needed a father who ran a company worth tens of millions to make their dignity real. They deserved it long before Deborah Whitfield ever learned their last name, long before Marcus made a single phone call, long before any airline had a reason to be afraid of losing anything. In a fair system, a valid ticket should never require a powerful person standing quietly behind it just to be believed. A valid ticket and the human being holding it should always have been enough on their own. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, maybe even yourself, like it so it can find the person who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's ever needed, reminding that they were never invisible. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stood in that cabin, in that exact moment? And if you have, which side of it were you standing on? I read every single answer.